My name is Albert Cerna Jr. I am the executive editor and founder of the Los Angeles Center for Investigative Journalism. It is a nonprofit, nonpartisan investigative newsroom that covers the San Gabriel Valley, just outside of Los Angeles and Greater Los Angeles. I'm also a professor of journalism at Mount San Antonio College and at Santa Ana College. I've been reporting in some capacity for around 17 years. I've done a lot of really grunt work kind of stuff. For any of you folks who were reporters in the mid 2000s, you remember those pop-up jobs that were like, be a reporter, and you worked for a little website that doesn't exist anymore. I've also done some really cool work with Muck Rock. I was their FOIA fellow a couple years back where I covered public records and documents for as a beat, and I worked for Open Secrets where I covered open government and money. Excuse me, not open government. It is money in politics. So I have a lot of experience in a lot of different places, but I am also a queer person. So I use he, him pronouns. But yeah, so that's a little about me. And this is a lot of the stuff that I like to talk about. So in just a second here, I'll start my presentation. If you have questions, ask them in the chat. Don't be afraid. At the very end, we're also going to have some time to answer some questions. But yeah, I really hope that this is informative for you. If you feel some of this stuff it may be repetitive because you are a queer person or you're involved in the queer community or you cover queer issues, that's okay. I geared this more towards people who are not familiar with queer communities and queer issues. So, it's a not you thing. It is just the best way to get more people involved and understanding. So let me share my screen here. And there we go. Okay. So can you all see this? Awesome. So this is what I'm calling reporting the rainbow. It's covering and serving queer communities. Basically, like I said, we're going to talk about how to report on and cover queer communities. We're going to take some actual data that I pulled and cleaned last week, and we're going to go through it and how to find stories about it. We're also going to understand a few different points. So, our agenda, why is this not working? There we go. Our agenda. So, we're going to start with queering the narrative, basically, how to take different topics or different stories that may not have a queer lens and reframe them for queer audiences or as unqueer topics. And then we're going to take numbers and talk about how to understand them in when it comes to queer reporting. If you were here for the last session, we looked at different data sources. So I took one of those data sources and I used that as my example for this. I would like to use more, but it is number heavy, and I don't want to bog you down with a lot of figures, especially if you don't do data regularly. And then we're going to talk about reporting across differences, what happens when you're not part of this community or when you're part of other communities, and how to cover them in an equitable and understanding way. So, hope I haven't lost you yet. So, we're going to go on and so queering their narrative. What does it mean to queer the actual narrative? Most, if not all, of the stories you cover can shift to a queer angle. It's really just about thinking about how the story works and the different functions of it. Consider how you might pivot if you, oh, that should be scooped, not shooped. I guess shooped too. I like that Cher song, the Shoop Shoop song. Um, Consider how you might pivot from a story if you get scooped, right? If you're reporting on a local government bill and another outlet scoops you, how might you pivot with that same level of reporting? Might you go into, okay, maybe instead of talking about that, um, I guess, topic altogether, maybe look at the funding behind it, maybe look at the key players. You do the same thing when you're looking to talk about queer stories and take your stories that you already have and focus on a queer angle. Think about what variables already exist in your story that feel queer quote coded. Are there things that maybe a queer audience or folks can relate to or that you think might be of interest to them? Is it an opportunity to educate the broader community? And just a quick Side note, I use the word queer all encompassing, but I mean LGBTQIA plus. It gets a little choppy to say it so many times, so I just use the word queer. So not in disrespect, but in reference to everybody. Okay. So that's how to think about queering the narrative, right? And then to do that, we really need to get a pulse on queer communities. So we need to understand what is happening in our communities. What is actually happening in queer communities, not just what we think or what we're seeing on TikTok or what we're seeing on television, but what is actually happening, boots on the ground reporting. Um, and then we have to think about whether or not we care about these stories, right? Do I care as a reporter about this story? Because when you don't care about a story, you're not going to put your heart in it and you're not going to be very as dedicated to the reporting. And then do you care about your story? I said that's twice. And why do you care about your story? Why does it matter to you as a reporter? Now we have to shift that framing to our audience and to the people that we're covering. Do queer people or communities think this story is relevant? You might think that, hey, this gay bar is opening and that's so cool, but it might be the fifth gay bar on the block, and the community's like, yeah, well, it's just another one. They might not care, right? And that's a very surface level one. Um, Maybe the latest drama about a queer personality or celebrity getting into some financial trouble, that might be of interest. So it really depends on what the topic is and really understanding the audience. And it goes to say when you're reporting on in general, understanding what your audience is interested in is critical. And that same goes for here, for when you cover queer communities. And then you have to think about sourcing, and there's two parts to this, and we'll talk about the second part a little bit later down. But we have to consider about the sources that we're using, whether they're relevant to the story, and can they speak to the topic? Are you just going up to a random queer person and saying, "Hey, you're a queer person, I'm writing a queer story. Talk to me," right? You wouldn't just do that for any other story. So you really have to understand and take critical care to know that the people that you're interviewing, the people you're reaching out to, they really have a stake in the story and can be experts for you. Um, don't approach people because you think that they would add like color or some level of exoticness in your imagery or in your shows. Don't go up to a random drag queen and ask about, the funding for your local city government. They might not know, they might, but if you're going because like, oh my God, her wig is so big and she's so pretty and I love it, like she has to know about this stuff. Her day job might be something completely different. So consider that. Um, when you're writing stories about trans and non-binary folks and genderqueer folks, always, always, always consider the boundaries that exist there. Um, Trans folks and non-binary folks have historically been misrepresented in media, so there are a lot of boundaries that exist outright. And if somebody tells you like, "Hey, I really don't want to talk to media, that's not my thing," um, you should probably respect that. Now, there's ways to try to get beyond those barriers and build trust, but really respect the boundaries outright. It shows better for you as a reporter to understand that, hey, I don't need to push this issue too hard. I can try to find somebody else who might be more willing to talk. Um, and then I think kind of along this lines, and probably one of the most important rules when you're sourcing is to understand that queer spaces are not always open to the public. And that means you. Not to say that they aren't public spaces, but they're not meant for a public space. Some spaces are specifically meant to be for trans folks or femme folks or, folks of color, queer folks of color. And yes, people are welcome to be there, but the space isn't designated for you. And so keep that in mind if you go out to a bar trying to find sources or like an event, and there are visible signs that like, oh, this is for trans feminine or trans masculine people. And I need to be very aware of that. This is not my space. This is not an area that I generally would come to, so I need to be respectful. And if you get asked to leave or step away, Don't argue, don't fight, don't try to put up a this is a public space kind of situation. Just say, okay, thank you. Whenever anybody wants to talk, I'll be right outside. So just some kind of ground rules and basics. And I know this might feel very obvious, but you'd be surprised at how many reporters don't realize this, especially reporters that aren't queer or don't have a lot of queer friends. So now that we have an understanding of how to queer the narrative and get the story, how do we go from the numbers that we're finding or using to understanding what the actual story is? If you were here for the last session I did, we looked at different sources of numbers, and I'm going to use one of those to kind of guide this understanding of a story from a queer angle and a queer lens. So when it comes to data that we want to use, there are mountains of it everywhere, and we can use that data to tell stories. Think about the different types of data that touch the experience of queer individuals and communities: money, resources, influence, you know, rates of housing, different kinds of data that exist that touch queer lives can be used and found everywhere. We need to know where that data is housed and how relevant it is. Is it outdated? Who collected it? Sometimes data can lie to us if it's not collected properly or if it's outdated. If it's presented with missing variables, it can really skew the picture. So being very critical of the data that we receive is important. And then we have to understand what we're asking the data and what we want to know, or want to know. What kind of story are we telling with this data? Is this a story about housing? Is this a story about political influence? Is it a story about health? Is it a story about wealth? What are we trying to tell, and how can this data help us? So for this one, we're going to talk about political influence because I think that's really important, especially when it comes to queer communities. Um, Queer folks have a lot of political power, but it's understated, right? The queer community is really good at organizing and getting together and forcing hands. We've seen that historically, but it's kind of under appreciated and underwhelming, not underwhelming, underrepresented. So when it comes to political influences, there aren't many coincidences in politics. Money specifically plays a big part in the political game, and following where that money comes from can lead to some great reporting on how politicians and key figures operate, and not just key figures who are anti-queer or anti-LGBTQ, but key figures within our own communities as well. There's a lot of queer folks who are very wealthy that have a lot of influence, good and bad. Um, and then we have to think about that influence, right? Does that influence come from a PAC, a political action committee, a corporation, or influence, individual influence? I don't know why I wrote that. Or does individual influence of a given aspect of the queer existence, right? Does a person's individuality influence different things? I know that, a lot of RuPaul Drag Race girls have popular influence in popular culture that translates over. Specifically, I'm thinking of Trixie Mattel, who became very, very wealthy with makeup and everything else. She does everything under the sun. So considering that stuff as well is key when we're talking about politics and political influence. There's a very famous former drag queen, trans woman. I think they're non-binary actually. Um, Maybe a girl who is running for office here in California. So looking at other political influence in queer communities is critical. So for this example, I want to look at Drag Pack. So who is Drag Pack? They're a carry committee, which is a hybrid political action committee that isn't specifically affiliated with a candidate and can operate in two ways: as a traditional PAC, which means that they can donate to a candidate, and as a super PAC, which means that they can make independent expenditures in an unlimited amount. Um, they have to have separate bank accounts for each of those purposes. And they can collect unlimited contributions from almost any source for independent expenditures, which is the super PAC side of it. But they can't use those funds for traditional PAC contributions like giving to a candidate. And so some years ago, I did a story about Drag Pack because I find them really interesting. They sell a lot of merch. They have a lot of the Rue girls representing them or being part of their campaigns. And this is the front of their website. So drag pack, right? We want to know what they do, and we know that they collect money. So we go to the FEC, the Federal Elections Commission, to see how much they're pulling in. And for this, I used the most recent 25, 26 data. It's not complete, obviously, because we're still in 26. And the 24 data was a little clunky, so I just thought that this would be easier. And when we go to the FEC website, we search drag pack, we can see a lot of information about it. But the stuff that we're interested in is the financial summaries. So we have what they've raised, right? And that is on the left side of your screens. We'll see the total receipts, which is about 54,000, 54 point, 54,000, we'll say. And we have a total contribution of 51,000. It's a lot of money. I mean, compared to a lot of other packs and super packs, it's pennies. But for a small organization, I would say that it's a lot, especially one run and built up by drag queens, which has never happened before. And we can see all of the different information right here, right? We can see the transfers that have existed, loans, loan repayments, some offsets to operating expenditures, candidate refunds, yada, yada, yada. That stuff will play a part if you dig deeper, but for now, for the what we're doing, we're gonna not look at that. On the right side, we can see how much they spent. So they have dispersed 60,000. And I want to just point out already there, we see a little bit of a discrepancy, right? They've brought in $54,000, but they've spent 60,000. That could be a holdover from what they received in the previous year. They might have some cash on hand. And I think I didn't put this picture in here, but they do have I think it was like $29,000 cash on hand at the start of this cycle. And then we look at other things, right? Their operating expenditures. How much they spent to operate? It's $250, really, really cheap. But they had 60,000 in other disbursements, and we don't really know what those disbursements are by looking at it. The best way to get that information is to download the data. So I looked at Open Secrets, which is a really great resource. They don't have the 25 data. It's stuff that you could request from them and they will give it to you. But based on the 24 data, I was able to see who's been given what, like who's giving them money. And what really stood out to me from the offset was the names. So Hillary Crane from LA. And then I saw a lot of Dylan Buckley Crane and a lot of and Maya Buckley Crane. So there's some cranes in here, right? And it seems to be that all of their money is coming from them. And it's not just like, $200 individual contributions. It's like 50,000, 45,000, 25,000. Pretty, pretty big money. So I went and I looked at their contributions from 2025, like how they're giving away money. And this is what I saw. Uh, Dylan contributed, or excuse me, how they're getting money. Dylan, this executive director, contributed 15,000, 20,000, 10,000, 10,000. So like, a pretty big chunk of money. And he's their executive director. So that was really interesting to me too. I was like, huh, why is their executive director giving all this money? Things to consider, right? The data I downloaded, by the way, was really clunky. I had to clean it up using programming language R, and I basically filtered out all of the other different markers that exist here and only pulled out the ones that I thought would be important. So the name of the pack, drag pack, the year, what type of person contributed, who they were, where they're from, where they work, their official title, the date, and then how much. So understanding how DragPack is collecting money is great, but I want to know too how they're spending it. So here's all their data for this year on how they've spent their money. And if we're looking at some of these, we can see that they spent $12,000 on fundraising consulting. I don't know what that means, but they paid it to somebody in Brooklyn. Um, they've also spent 10,000 on social media strategy. I think they've actually spent, let's see, yeah, it looks like 20 grand on social media strategy. It might be a little less, might be a little more, but they're spending a lot of money on social media. I don't see anywhere that they've contributed to any kind of political campaign. So that might be the PAC side of things. They haven't donated to a single candidate. This stuff also might be that, from the super PAC, they might be paying for people's social media. So we don't know. These are questions that are left unanswered, but they're places that we can start pulling threads and being like, huh, what is Drag Pack really doing? And again, doesn't mean that it's a bad thing. It just gives us points to understand and to start developing theories on what we can write about. So with this data, my first things are, what are the social media strategies for? Are they for specific candidates? Are they getting money from different avenues? How is their CEO or their executive director paying so much? Where is he getting the money from? Just basic questions. So we want to interview this data the same way we would interview a source, right? What is it telling us? In 25, most contributions came from one person, the executive director. How did he get that money? What does it mean in the context? Is this person collecting individual donations and submitting them all at once? We don't know because we haven't asked. Um, this may be something to report, or it may not be, right? It may just be part of their own philosophy. When I went to their website to try to dig more, there was hardly anything in there, and it asked me to submit a media inquiry, which I didn't. But, these are just things to keep in mind as we're trying to use the data to tell queer stories. And then most importantly, is this data misleading? It could be because there are variables we don't know unless we ask, right? We don't know if their executive director is pulling funds from somewhere. We don't know where these social media strategy campaigns are going. We don't, and that's okay. The data is leading us to these different stories and it's giving us the opportunity. And the same can be said about different data that we collect from different places on different topics. So then we have to ask about it. We need to ask questions like we do with any other story. Where does DragPack get its money? How is Dylan, the executive director, able to donate so much? These are questions that just pop up as we're looking at these figures. Are there other small donations coming in? This we know to be true because they sell merch at some local stores, shirts that say Drag Pack, that's how they're earning some money. It's another little interesting tidbit, like small donations, do they count? Do people have to put their name if they're coming from one organization? Yada, yada, yada. Um, and then where are these contributions going, if they're going anywhere at all? So asking about the parameters of the data, the money that we see come in and out, those are all how we tell this story. And if we're looking at it from a different lens, you could go to any political action committee and write about it, and it would do the same thing. The only difference here is that we're looking at a queer angle. This might be a story that you could see in The Advocate or them or, any of the other queer publications or outlets that exist. So really taking a money and politics story and putting it on a queer lens is what we just did here. And then we have to get the full picture of this too, right? And like with Drag Pack, data and queer topics require some nuance, a lot of nuance sometimes. Is there a cultural or community aspect about this topic that comes into play when we talk about the data, right? Does the data have some sort of relation to how communities organize or exist or operate? Do public figures come into play? And are they aware of what the data tell us? In the terms of Drag Pack, they have a lot of Rue girls that are involved in getting the word out there. Do they know how this political action committee is supposed to work, or are they just hired to do a commercial and support it? We don't know. As journalists, we're overly informed, but our sources aren't always. So we have to ask, are our sources as informed as we are? The answer is probably no, but it could be yes. So one of the folks who is involved in Drag Pack, they go by Big Dipper. They're a DJ party promoter here in LA, he's very informed about this. I was able to interview him a couple of years ago. Excuse me, I wasn't able to interview him a couple of years ago, but he was the one answering all my questions. Very smart, very much aware of how this group operates. So some people are, some people aren't. So now that we have our stories, we have to really understand how to report across the differences that may exist between us in our own sphere and the communities, specifically the queer communities that exist, right? And these differences come in a lot of different forms. So we have to understand that when we cover communities we're not part of, there's a level of cultural humility and cultural competence that exists, right? We can't write in the context of being an expert if we're not. If you're not part of this community, if you're not part of the queer community, you're not an expert. You don't really know what all of the nuance is. You don't know what's happening. You hear it, you know, as a third party, but you have to accept that you're not an expert. You're going into these spaces and you're asking questions to be informed. And just because you've seen something on RuPaul's Drag Race doesn't mean you know drag culture or language or lexicon. You're not just going to walk up to a source and go, "Yes, girl, you're serving. Slay down the house boots, mama. Okay, right?" Like, it's just not what you do. You might be trying to build some sort of rapport, but you don't really know what you're saying, and it kind of is cringe. JVN isn't the gay messiah. The celebrities that we see on TV, on in reality TV, aren't the speak all. They aren't representative of the entire community. And just because you watch Queer Eye or The Traitors or any of these other shows or movies doesn't mean that those people have an automatic say on behalf of everything that's happening. And they're a very small sliver of our communities. And going back to, the boots the house down, mama, words, idioms, and phrases are ours, so please respect them. And generally, a lot of queer lexicon comes from, you know, uh, Black culture as well. So we have to understand where the words that we're using are coming from. So just be cautious. Understand that you are not always part of these communities and that have to take that as the most important part when we're going out and doing interviews. And so sourcing too, Revenge of the Queen, right? Knowing who to go to for information is key, but getting them on the record can be very tough. Poor representation has really left a stain on how reporters interact with queer communities. And so a lot of queer folks can be weary of speaking to reporters, and for good reason, right? There was a long time when people would come in and, want to talk to an overtly flamboyant gay man or a very butch lesbian or a trans woman, and they wanted to depict and characterize this community as just that. There was no multi-level, multi-dimensional experience there. So there's a lot of weariness when it comes to this. Like with any other underserved community, right? Journalism can do better. So I respect the hesitation. It is critical to be persistent, obviously, but understanding when to back off and show respect and understanding of a person is just as critical. I think it shows more it's better optics when you're able to say, you know what? Yeah, I can step back. I understand that you don't want to talk right now. You're very important to this story, but I'll hold back. I'll give you time. We can work it out later. I think that shows a lot of respect and it really goes towards building trust with the community and with sources. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't emphasize the need for the story and why the source's voice matters. Be very clear. Hey, I'm telling this story about Drag Pack, and I know that you are very involved in fundraising, and I really need your voice in this story to understand how, this organization operates and how the money you've raised is going to support queer issues. Be very clear, be very transparent, and let folks know where you're going with this story. What direction are you moving in? Um, Highlight your own lack of understanding too, um, because it lets folks know that you value your own ability to learn, right? Why is it important for you to understand this so that you can tell the story? If you come in to a group and say, "Hey, look, I don't know this. I need somebody to tell me. I don't expect you to train me because, that's not your obligation. I just really want to understand how your community operates and, how it relates to this story." Come from a place of understanding, genuine understanding. Don't say you want to understand and then just throw it out the window when the story's done. Keep it with you and hold it, as I think was it the interviewer said to Ariana, we're holding space for it. Hold space for it. Hold space for this new knowledge and understanding that you are looking for and use it and continue to grow. I think that's one of the beautiful things about being a reporter is we learn a lot and we get to keep that information and it allows us to grow as people. And then remember too that queer communities are incredibly diverse, right? Queer communities are intersectional across multiple fault lines, and that just means that there's a lot of different lines of existence that collide in a single person and in a community. When we talk about race, right? Queer folks are not just white people, although that gets a lot of overrepresentation. There's a lot of people of color in our community. And race impacts the experiences on multiple levels, especially when we cover criminal justice, right? If we're writing a data story about, how many hate crimes existed or, how many arrests of queer folks happened in the last couple of years in a given area, we have to understand the relationship between queer folks, race, and the criminal justice system. So keeping that in mind as we move along is also really important. Gender is another important thing to think about and consider. We honor they, she, him, and any other pronoun that people identify by. Asking somebody's pronouns is really important, and sharing your own is also important. And you don't share your pronoun because you feel like, oh, I need to, let people know that this is how I identify, but you also do it to just make people comfortable sharing their own pronouns. I tend to ask folks what their pronouns are in my reporting when along with the what's your name, how old are you, where are you from, it just gives me a better understanding. And if for whatever reason you do use the wrong pronoun, address it immediately, like, oh, I'm sorry, and move on. Don't harbor on it. If the person wants to give you a moment of education and say, hey, these are my pronouns and here's why I, identify with this, or this is how I identify, hear it, say thank you, and move on, right? Don't make it a big deal, but make sure that you do apologize and that you're considerate of those things. Um, Class is another thing that we really need to consider when we're covering these communities. Queer folks have been historically disenfranchised, both financially, economically, and on long different lines. Class, income, and ability all should be taken into consideration when you're writing a story or when you're digging into data. How do these different aspects impact this? Are you going to have to use a deeper level of understanding? Are you going to have to really find an interpreter who might use sign language to help you in your reporting? Are you, obviously, if you're going into areas that are, um, you know, lower income, you don't want to show up in a full suit as a reporter. You want to really dress comfortably, but to make people feel comfortable with you as well. So these are all different parts, and I want to say that these are not the only different intersectional fault lines that exist within the community, but they are some of the most important to consider. Um, just like you and I have different intersectional lives and we live across different fault lines, so do queer communities. So you can't look at one queer community and assume that it is the same as another. Like the folks in LA are not the same folks in Phoenix, are not the same folks in Tampa, are not the same folks in Minneapolis, right? We have to understand that different areas give different environments and give different impacts. So as you report these stories, as you're using your skills as a journalist, keep these to heart. And I know that we all do this already, but we seem to forget that when we cover queer stories, that same level of diversity exists. We think of queer as just one singular, oh, this is the diversity, when really it's the tip of the iceberg in diversity. Some of the resources that I have found useful and that I would encourage you to use as you report, as you develop stories. The NLGGA style book is really good. I have used it multiple times. I give it to my students. I think it's great. The Diversity Style Guide by Rochelle Canigal is really great too. It's a little bit of an older book, but I still find that it's very practical and useful. The GLAD Media Reference Guide has been great. There's some people who feel differently. I think it's okay to use with, again, just keeping an understanding of how things may have changed. And of course, the Trans Journalist Style Guide. That one is critical when you're covering issues of trans and non-binary folks, and just gender in general. So keep those at hand and reference them. I believe the NLGJA Style Guide and the TJA Trans Journalists Association Style Guide are both free online, but if not, you can just reach out to them and they'll send you a copy. And just a quick note too, language and culture is always evolving. When these books are printed or put out, things may have changed, right? The lexicon that we use may have changed. So keep that in mind. And when a source tells you, oh, we don't say that, or that word is offensive, or that's not appropriate, rely on that. Even though the style guide might say differently, you want to respect your sources at all times. And with that, I think that's about all I have, and I want to give you guys time to ask some questions. So I'll stop sharing here. Um, and if we have any questions or you guys want to talk about some stories that you have or how to frame them in a queer lens or where to get data, happy to answer all of those for you guys, you folks.
And if everyone would prefer to ask questions with the recording off, let me know and I can turn that off as well. But Albert, I loved all the memes.
Thank you.
Hmm.
I didn't want to make it too boring. I know some of the data stuff can get a little heavy, so try to put a bit of humor.
Um, there's a message from Ari and saying, I'm writing for an LGBTQ organization and looking for places to get data. Any tips? I think this actually goes really well back to the last session you did, Albert.
Yeah. Well, Ari, it depends on what kind of data you want, right? Some of the best places to start would probably be, well, if you're looking at, excuse me, if you're looking at geographic data, you might want to look at just the census. It doesn't specifically label for queer individuals, but you can see, I don't know if they've changed it recently, see households with dual income married folks. Um, you could look at the Open Secrets data, which gives you organizations that either anti-LGBTQ or pro to get information on money and politics. You can look at how folks are spending or how politicians are voting using it's the HRC Human Rights Campaign. They have a tracker as well on that. Depends. What kind of data specifically are you looking for? I think that might be able to give me an insight onto better how to better help you. Ah,
HIV.
okay. So you could look at data from well, the World Health Organization will give you broad data, like very large sets of data, and it's more world. You can look at the Centers for Disease Control. They release data as well regularly, and it's another acronym. Gosh darn it. I forget forgetting the name of it off the top of my head, but it's another DC organization. I would also look at the AHF, Age Healthcare Foundation. They have a lot of data on their own website. If it's not publicly available, you can reach out and ask them. They'll give it to you. Treatment, if we're talking regional specific, there's orgs here in Los Angeles like Altamed, Bienestar that track and collect data. The states also do, some state health agencies. You can talk to local hospitals. They're generally really good about giving you information about increases or decreases, treatment levels, medication. So it really depends. Actually, too, um, Gilead, I think that's how I say it. I never say it right. Might have data on PrEP and PEP, PrEP specifically on how many people are taking it. So that might also lead to some more data that you can pull. Not all of it is public, so you would probably have to request it because sometimes it becomes proprietary and they don't want to share it because they've done their own R&D. But it never hurts to ask. So I would go to those places first. Start with the public and then go down to private. Of course. If you want to talk later, reach out. I have some old reporting I did about HIV, so I can see what I have and fish around and give you what I got.
Any other, oh yeah, any other questions? And also, as a reminder, I'll be uploading this recording to the Muck Rock YouTube. And so I'll be sending out that link later today. So if any of your colleagues were unable to attend, you can share that with them. And I'll be sharing links to different things that Albert mentioned today. Um,
Thank you.
Chelsea? Oh, is that?
Yes, sorry. Hi. I'm like messing up all the reactions. Apologies. But great job, Albert. I appreciate it. So this is a conversation I had with my news team. I'm based in Arizona. I work for a nonprofit newsroom. Um, and it's not specifically related to the LGBTQ plus community, but I guess it could. And it definitely is related to identity. But we had one of my colleagues interview somebody who requested that their name be spelled all lowercase. That's how they choose to go by, choose to represent themselves, and they were or are a protester and a part of that sort of movement. And it was a sort of stance on that sort of front. And we had a conversation about whether or not we do it because, obviously in journalism, names are capitalized and kind of a little friendly debate about, if we choose to do something like that or when we draw that line. And it kind of reminded a lot of us of the they, them pronouns when that was coming out, and kind of how the debates were going on about that. So just curious your take on that.
Yeah. So first of all, I love the Luminaria. I went to ASU and I'm a huge fan of what you guys do out there. So great work. And to your point, to your question, I really don't see the harm in respecting how somebody chooses to spell their name, right? And I kind of associate that back to the different spellings of Eric and Erica, right? Erika, Ericka, Erica. How a person chooses to spell their name and identify, I think, should be respected. If we put the honorifics of doctor, if we put suffixes like junior, which I use, it's out of respect of the person. And I think as reporters, we should do our best to build that respect, especially if we're local and hyper local. Um, if the person chose to spell their name and it for a very specific reason in all lowercase, then, a simple note in copy of, you know, person's name, uh, chooses to use all lowercase in protest, comma, rest of the copy doesn't hurt. I think it's fine. You know, we respect people's pronouns, we respect people's names. We don't dead name. So I think that those are really important things to do.
Great, great. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that. And I just had a follow-up. I'm sorry, I don't mean to take everyone's time, but that was kind of the general consensus that we had was, respecting people's identities and that's how we would choose to go about it. Turns out the quote ended up being a really small part of the story. And so another question that led us into was like, do we put it in the story and then kind of explain a little bit like why the person is doing this? But if that has nothing to do with the overall story, would that just take people out of like the main story and put it into something else? Like, I guess, would you go about explaining that to readers in any way? Because it is not typical in journalism.
I think it depends on the publication, right? For LACIJ, I think I would just put a quick note following the way, like I said, you know, so and so, their name, who spells it all lowercase because of protest, comma, whatever. Some publications might put an asterisk and an editor's note at the bottom. Some might delve deeper and let that be a graph or two in the story if there's any relation. But I think it's really a stylistic choice. For me, I think I would just put in copy a couple of words explaining and move on. That way the reader knows, that way your copy editor knows, and if this story is ever up for an award, the folks who do those awards know too.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Mhm. Mm. Um, are there any other questions or comments? I'm loving seeing everything in the chat. But so feel free to keep putting stuff in there, or if you want to unmute too, you can also chat.
Yeah, Austin, I really like what you're saying about not wanting to other queer sources, you know, but also being aware that sometimes there is that linear distinction, right? Some folks in the queer community want to establish their separation from a society that generally tends to lean more homophobic, transphobic in their eyes and historically. So being aware of that and saying like, okay, yeah, this is a moment where we respect the wishes of our source versus folks who feel the opposite. Like, I don't want to be seen as different. I want to make sure that I'm treated the same and keeping that into consideration. So yeah, up to newsrooms how to do it respectfully, but you know, othering isn't always bad, but it's not always good either.
Any other questions, comments?
I actually have another question, if you don't mind. I deal with forums a lot and inputting with people inputting information and trying to make sure that again, with the othering, a lot of times you see a form with gender and there's other in there and things like that. Do you have a good source for best practices for titling fields? I know it's kind of a weird, not really a journalism question.
I think it is kind of because in data journalism we have to figure that out.
Mm,
It would really depend. I mean, the conversation around gender and identity has really ballooned and been more prevalent, which is much needed, right? Because we know that there's all kinds of different gender identities and markers. It really depends on the data you're looking at, right? Um, if you're looking at options for other, you might go back to the source of the data and ask for a data dictionary. Because that'll tell you exactly what it means. And you can be very clear. Does other mean, intersex? Does it mean non-binary? Does it mean agender? Does it mean two-spirit? Like, what does it actually mean? And sometimes people don't have an answer for that. And so you yourself would just leave it blank. Now, you could ask, does this encompass all of these things that you might have, right? Like if you're writing something and you're like, okay, there's male, female, non-binary, transmasc, transfemme, and then other. You might say, I think other is X, Y, and Z. Go to your source and say, hey, this is what I think. Is this true? And then include it. If not, just say other was not defined. And that can be a tricky one because, again, agency to agency, data set to data set, it's different. And hopefully there's something more uniform, but gender's complex. And so we want to respect that that is also changing and our understanding of gender is complex.
that's super helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions, comments? So if not, we can wrap up a bit early today. Um, and in the email that I sent that I will send out, I'll also include Albert, your email, if that's all right.
Absolutely.
And yeah, and you'll get it from my email, so you'll have my email as well.
I have a question if we still have a few minutes.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm curious, Albert, how you think about the increasing sort of removal or relabeling of LGBTQ data sets, particularly federally managed data sets, from both a sort of reporting standpoint and a data practices standpoint?
It's a really good question. It makes me really mad. I think when we take data out, it takes out a slice of our own understanding, not specifically when it comes to queer data, but just in general. Um, as we see the removal and erasure of queer specific data, we're losing an entire population and an opportunity to understand and help people. Um, right now, the way that things are going, as a reporter, it is scary because it doesn't give me the full picture. And it's annoying as a queer person because it tells me that my existence isn't relevant, which I know isn't a fact. I think when we talk about data, right, it can lead to a lot of different errors. If we're taking out entire columns that deal with race and gender and sexual identity, we can lose critical understanding of how, you know, resources are being used, how communities are interacting with the criminal justice system, the health system, with each other. So I think it's really important that we don't lose that data. And there's some folks that are doing really good work to archive it. Internet Archive, for example. And there's a group, I think it's, oh man, I don't remember the name. It's a decentralized group of data folks who downloaded a bunch of databases to try and preserve them. I know that Muckrock at one point did that.
DLP, is that what you're thinking of?
Who is it?
Data, Data Liberation Project?
Yes, yes. Um, they yeah, and Data Rescue Project, yeah. Uh, they downloaded a bunch of data as we saw a transition from the last administration to the current one, and as agencies were shutting down. Even back before that, there was the EPA was the host of a lot of the records and documents that existed, and so all of that was downloaded. So it exists somewhere, and hopefully, sometime soon we will see the return of those data sets and more informed data. And I think it also goes down to a university system, right? Which is where a lot of research comes from. I think universities need to be very forward in pushing for collection and gathering and maintaining and housing the data that affects, impacts, and allows us to understand queer and trans folks. I hope that answered your question. I know that was very long-winded.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Um, Also to Amy, I saw you doing this. So I don't know if you have an opinion about if you've tried to
Yeah,
get data on any of those sites and
yeah, I can say from the perspective of, by the way, I'm secretly not a journalist. I'm an evaluator. And I work for a consulting firm. We work with nonprofits. I've worked on a lot of journalism projects, and I'm the co-chair of the American Evaluation Association's LGBTQ plus group. And I presented on this at our conference last year, was about changes in LGBTQ data collection. And the reason I was doing this was because there's certain things like they've been tried to be archived that aren't necessarily may not have been captured. There were pieces and things that like we know were gone, but we're not sure at this point like all of the information that is gone. And there's also a lot of uncertainty federally about future data collection. That was part of what my presentation was, and focusing on getting to the people that went to our presentation and then did a blog post about it of like alternative data sources, which depending on what the topic is, are some things exist, some things don't. It's very piecemeal still, and certain things are still unclear about like what kind of data will still be collected, and also identifying with certain data sets, like what actual data like has been captured in a way that is accessible elsewhere and what actually isn't. So that's why I was doing that, because I'm not. There are certain things I know that for sure have been removed, but I'm not totally sure if they're in the group of things that there is a original unaltered form of out there.
Hmm.
And sometimes it's about piecemealing
Yeah.
too. It's like taking data from one agency, matching it to another where certain columns or markers might not be there, but they're here in another one under a different name. So when you get into data and especially like data journalism, it can be very, very tricky, and very, very nuanced and time consuming. But there is some ways and sometimes there's just not.
Yeah. Also, as an exciting reference to other sunlight trainings, we actually have a recording on, well, it was a couple different organizations that came, including Data Rescue Project and Data Liberation Project. And in that training, talking a lot about how there is disappearing data and then how you can be kind of like a citizen archivist and how you can identify different data that you really want to keep track of and keep track of that. And there are also amazing tools with Muckrock that allow you to do so. So, woo. So if you have any questions about either that training, and I can direct you to where that reporting is, or like Klaxon Document Cloud, really great tools for tracking data changing. Just reach out to me and we can chat about that. Cool. Well, Albert, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for being with us for 2 months in a row. It's been so exciting.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah. And thanks everyone for attending today. Apologies again about the issues with the Zoom link. As I mentioned, there have been issues as we've been merging and 2 different Zooms. So hopefully this will be the end of it, the Zoom problems. But yeah, make sure to share this around with any of your colleagues if they really wanted to attend but couldn't make it today.
Thank you, folks.
Thanks, y'all. I'll stop the recording now.